and we have space for questions in the end. If you have burning questions during the workshop, please put them in the chat, and Hannah will curate them for us. So as Hannah noted, this is the environment and Deuteronomy. This is an environmental themed mood, and I had this workshop already prepared, so I thought it was an easy fit to offer this today. As Hannah noted, I'm the professor of diversity studies at the Hebrew Seminary in Chicago, and I have a couple of websites and some social media. If you go to rabbah.rona.us and click on the workshops tab, you'll find access to the slides for today's presentation if you want to refer to them for future usage. And you can see a picture of the book that I wrote a few years ago. That's available on ronamatlow.com. So why do we study environmental issues? Well, as you can see from NOAA, and I have friends who have worked at NOAA and have told me firsthand about how bad things really are. 23 had record global climate events. And we have to be concerned about that because these events are beyond what you might expect from normal planetary cycles. And we do know that the planet goes through cycles. We've had ice ages and melting ages and so forth. So the planet does go through cooling cycles and warming cycles. But what we're seeing is way beyond what could possibly be expected by a planetary cycle. And of course, we know about things like plastics in the waters and toxic chemicals and carbon in the air and all the other things. When some of us were younger, we were concerned about the ozone layer, and so we stopped using chlorofluorohydrocarbons and aerosol propellants and things like that. So we've been concerned about things in the air for a long time. Being here in Las Vegas, where the sun is very plentiful, I have an electric powered house that charges an electric powered car. So I try to minimize my use of dinosaurs as much as possible. Now, electric power, even solar power and battery power are not perfect. They have their own baggage, but at least we're not putting carbon in the air. And NASA announced that last summer was the hottest on the record. And we have to be very concerned about that. I just saw a map a few days ago that by 2100, they expect that all coastal spaces of the United States will be inundated to probably 50 miles. The entire state of Florida will be gone because of the rising sea levels. Of course, there are those who don't believe in rising sea levels, but I can tell you that in 2015, we took a South Pacific cruise and we saw coral atolls that were nearly subsumed by the rising sea levels. The residents there told us how much territory they had lost because of the sea level change. So we've seen it firsthand, the damage that's been done already. So this is some standard boilerplate that I put in every biblical workshop that I teach. I don't say the Bible because there's no such thing as the Bible. In Judaism, we have the Tanakh, which is the acronym for Torah, Nevi'im or prophets, and Ketuvim or writings. The Christians have the Old Testament, which is not the same as the Tanakh. It differs by denomination, language, and content, and also arrangement. Different denominations have different orders for it. And of course, they have the New Testament. So I try to say Bible or biblical text as much as possible, because there is no such thing as the Bible. Although if you listen to evangelicals, they'll tell you that whatever translation that they're using is the Bible that God wrote. and Jesus specifically gave it to them in that English translation, even though Jesus never heard of English. When we look at environmental studies in Bible, we're reflecting our values into the text. Biblical authors didn't know of these issues or any other modern issues such as feminism, disability issues, queer issues, etc. It's important that we remember when we look at biblical texts, we need to look at it from the time they were written and then look at it from our modern lenses to get full understanding of the biblical texts. Now, God language. I just learned the other day that JPS is releasing a new gender sensitive Tanakh, and they're using small capital letter God for the name, which just adds more confusion because the 4-letter word doesn't say God. Elohim says God. Parsing the 4-letter name is very difficult. I just use the Orthodox solution of saying Hashem, the name, because I don't like to get into the baggage associated with Adonai, which literally means the Lord's, plural. It carries anthropomorphism and gender, and it has references to slavery. So to avoid all the baggage, and some people say it's a cop-out, some people say it's too orthodox, but it's a very elegant solution, and I haven't found a better one. So I just say Hashem when I come across the 4-letter name. In Deuteronomy, there are texts that talk about global warming and the environment. Some are prophetic, some are commandments, but if we fail to heed these texts, we bear the responsibility. Now, one major text that we have in Deuteronomy has been removed from progressive liturgy due to the issue of theodicy. And I think it's very unfortunate because it can be read without theodicy, strictly from the standpoint of human agency. And we're going to explore this text now. And I see Fred nodding his head. I think Fred knows where I'm going. Okay, so what is theodicy? According to the Oxford Dictionary, it means the vindication of good in the face of evil. God couldn't have done evil because God is good. In practice, it means that biblical texts blame the victim. Thus, certain biblical texts we study have been removed from progressive liturgy due to theodicy. So examples of theodicy. Your field caught fire and your house burned down. Too bad you didn't tithe properly. God is punishing you. Or your child was born with birth defects. You shouldn't have had sex when your wife had her period. God is punishing you for that. Those are examples of theodicy, blaming the victim because you didn't follow the biblical text. And these are the kinds of things that we try to avoid because it's just not helpful. It's not pastoral and it really misses the point anyway. But we know from Viet Hanan that God is promising us all kinds of good stuff if we follow, Haazina rather, not Viet Hanan, that God is following us all kinds of good stuff if we follow Torah. And we see, the finest wheat and the cream of the wheat and everything. We see similar imagery in Psalm 81, the Psalm for Thursday. Okay, so this is a promise from God. If we follow the Torah and do God's will, we're going to have all kinds of great stuff in our lives. But what happens if we don't? The second paragraph of the Shema. If you turn away from the God and bow down to other gods, the God will become angry with you, and God will close up the heavens, and you won't have the rain, and the ground will become hardened, and it won't lead the land. In other words, Israel. When it says the land in Torah, it means Israel, won't yield its produce, and you'll be pushed off the land very quickly that God promised and gave to you. So this is talking about idolatry, following the Baal, right? But we can read this in a modern context, can't we? So look at David Ellenson in the My People's Prayer book. Its detailed description of the bountiful or devastating consequences of Israel's collective relationship to the mitzvot offers a supernatural theology that many contemporary Jews find difficult. Simply put, it presents a doctrine of reward and punishment that most liberal Jews have found problematic, if not offensive. Therefore, it's been removed from liberal prayer books in the modern era. So David Ellenson, Zichron Livracha, who used to be the head of the Reform movement, wrote about this in the My People's Prayer book, explaining why it was removed from liberal liturgy. But Judith Klaskow goes on, it's not necessary to read this paragraph of the Shema as a literal statement about divine reward and punishment. In a world where survival depends partly on human capacity to value creation and care for it wisely, it's possible to interpret the passage more naturalistically. Aha. If we're able to develop an ecological consciousness, if we treat the earth with respect, if we're aware that we're embedded with the great web of life, which God is the ultimate source and sustainer, then the earth will bear fruit for us and the rain will come in its season. But if we believe we can trample or transcend the constraints of nature, if we forget the sacredness of all things and make idols of our own wealth and power, the earth will not grant its produce, and both we and our world may perish. So what Plaskow is saying here is that if you worship the Baal of Mammon, if you chase after wealth and be a gross capitalist and forget about what we're supposed to be doing in protecting our world, then this is what happens. And we see that that's exactly what's happened in our lifetime. We've become gross consumerists and capitalists. And, you know, my stepdaughter is very counterculture, but her daughter just asked my wife for a gift card to some very expensive, fancy mall store for her birthday present. You know, it's kind of like Michael P. Keaton or Alex P. Keaton Redux from the TV show back in the 90s, if you all remember that show, Family Ties. You know, gross consumerism gets everybody at some point in their life. And the second paragraph of the Shema is a midrash on that, if we read it that way. And that's exactly what Plaskow is saying here. Now, I saw this in the second paragraph of the Shema before I read what Plaskow wrote, but Plaskow just strengthens my belief in this. So I'll ask here if there's any questions or comments about what we've said so far. Yeah, Fred.
So I just put in the chat that actually the quote from the Reconstructionist prayer book was a bit out of context, because the 1994 quote goes on to say, and that was then, and now we've reintroduced the second paragraph because it's such an important ecological parable. So that happily was actually the cause for it, so that the Reconstructionist movement is now davening with that explanation there for the last 30 years.
Hello, hi. I don't frequent Reconstructionist congregations, but I'm very glad to hear that. So thank you.
Right. It's just David Ellenson, or you, I'm not sure, just cut the quote short, so it feels acontextual.
Well,
but
thank you for that.
beautiful,
That's very wonderful.
but beautiful teaching. God is the landlord, and we are but tenants. We could be evicted.
And this feels very much like Yom Kippur too, doesn't it? Even though we're facing Pesach, but I feel very much like, you know, almost like the Unatana Toka for something reading this too. Other questions or comments here? Okay. So the Tochacha in Deuteronomy 28 also says the same thing. The skies above your head will be like copper, and the ground below you will be like iron. God will turn the rain of your land into dust, and dirt will fall from the heavens until you are destroyed. So again, this is talking about not following Torah and doing things that God feels are evil, and this is what's going to happen. Remember that the Tochacha is telling you what will happen after the Israelites enter the land of Israel if they don't follow Torah. So this is the same kind of thing. Now, of course, text critics will say that this is after the first exile, and so it's historical rather than prophetic. When I do Torah scholarship, I actually don't grapple with the question of who wrote biblical texts. I don't find it relevant in my work, and so I don't deal with it. I just go with what the text says because I find that very compelling. You know, I drash on the text as it is because that's what we have in front of us. And I know that what we have in front of us couldn't possibly have existed at the time of the Israelites, because when you look, for instance, at the Isaiah scroll in the Israel Museum, it has both ancient and Assyrian block text, and Isaiah is much later than Torah, and it still has the mixture of alphabets. And so clearly Torah, which was written in the ancient text, had to be translated into the Assyrian text. And so what we have is obviously not what was written back in the day. And then we have another rebuke in Nitzavim. And the later generations will say that to those who come after you and the stranger who comes from distant lands, you'll see the plagues of the land and its diseases that God struck it with. Sulfur and salt spoil the land. Okay, so we have chemical poisoning of the land. So it can't be planted, will not sprout or bring forth food, like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Savoyim, that God struck in divine anger and rage. Okay, so, you know, salt and sulfur and so forth, chemical poisoning. We certainly see that plenty, don't we? Whether we're talking about overuse of agricultural chemicals, whether we're talking about toxic chemical spills from industry, heavy metal poisoning of our rivers, whatever it is, it's all right here in the Tochacha, isn't it? It's pretty hairy when you read this stuff and realize that it's all here in the Torah. It's really pretty shocking. So, environmental disaster prophecies. So when we're talking about other gods in the modern sense, we said already that we're talking about the capitalism, the consumerism, the mammon. Okay. So a discussion question for those of you who are participating. Do you believe that God is directly intervening in our world today? If so, how? And if not, what do these verses mean for us today, since these verses are saying that God is causing these things? So anybody, please pop in.
I don't want to be the only one speaking, so anyone else feel free, but quickly, kind of natural consequences. If other gods means the things that we care the most about, and that turns out to be the marketplace, and the marketplace is polluting, then the natural consequence of where we've put our priorities is, again, being evicted from the good land that God has given us.
Okay. So you're taking a naturalist approach that it's direct consequences of our actions. Good. Other people? Hannah, I think I see some gears turning there.
Yeah, well, we have a comment in the chat that says, yes, God can shift the probability that something will happen. So I guess the comment is that yes, God does directly intervene, but maybe in the trajectory of things.
Okay. So, all right, I will tell you that my belief, aside from issues like the Mises in the Talmud with the bat kol, with things like the river reversing course and the tree uprooting, God doesn't directly intervene in the world since the end of prophecy. That's what I've been taught. My theology is that God creates opportunities for us, and I kind of give a metaphor of it as a hallway with a bunch of doors that God creates for us. And we walk down that hallway, and we have to be bold enough to suss out what door to walk through. And I can tell you that I've walked through a lot of doors in my life, and I've never regretted walking through a door. But you got to take that step and walk through the door, you know. But God didn't force me to pick any one particular door. God just gave me the doors. But I don't believe that God forced me to choose any one particular door over the other. They all look the same. I just had a sense that that was the right door for me. But
We have one more comment. Everything is interconnected. Is that a way of thinking about God? So all action has interconnected consequences.
sure, absolutely, everything is interconnected. You know, we talk about God being transcendent. So if God is transcendent, God's energy is in everything. So absolutely. Good. Okay. So this one's going to be a little touchy. There's a lot of really intense feelings, especially today after Iran just attacked Israel, which is unprecedented, and I'm, really kind of in shock over that. I mean, it's one thing with Hamas attacking Israel, but Iran doing this means we're, unfortunately, I'm afraid, heading towards world war. Biden said he's not going to get into it. So he's trying to exercise restraint right now and keep us from getting into a global war. But I'm afraid it's going to happen anyway. But content warning, the next topic does deal with the Israel-Palestine war. So in Deuteronomy 20, we have the prohibition against destroying fruit trees in war. When you besiege a city for a long period to go to war against it and seize it, you shall not cut down its trees by axe, because fruit comes for them. And then we have this very strange statement, for as manna tree of the fields to come before a siege. Only trees that you know are not food trees may be cut down to build siege works against a city that is waging war on you until it has been captured. So basically, it's an Isur D'Oraita, a biblical prohibition to cut down fruit trees in war. Yet, we know that the Tzahal, the Israeli Defense Forces, and the West Bank settlers have been chopping down Palestinian olive orchards. And as a rabbi, I find it reprehensible that the Rabbanut, the state-sanctioned rabbis of Israel, have been allowing this and haven't done anything to stop it. If you're not aware, in halakha, Jewish law, an Isur D'Oraita, biblical prohibition, is the strongest form of prohibition. So it's my opinion that the leaders of the Memshalah of the Israeli government and the leaders of the Rabbanut belong in prison. Now, I am not anti-Zionist. I believe in the state of Israel, but not in the government of Israel. And I have to emphasize that the people and the state are not the same thing. And the majority of the people did not elect the current government. Remember that it's a coalition form of government, and less than 30% of the people voted Netanyahu's party. But, and also it's important to remember that none of this justifies the dreadful actions that Hamas took on October 7th. But it's if you understand trauma theory, it's easy to understand why the Palestinians are so upset. Am Yisrael Chai. Questions, comments? Fred, I saw your head going a mile a minute there. Looks like you have something on your mind there. You're muted still, Fred. You want to keep going? Okay. So what are you feeling about the government's actions vis-a-vis the olive trees?
Great. Okay, got it now. In the early 1970s, the group of the New Jews, Arthur Waskow was one of the leaders of that field, actually opposed Agent Orange in the Vietnam War on exactly these grounds. Not only was it indiscriminate killing of people, but it was destruction of the ecosystem. It's also worth noting that a lot of the progressive Jewish groups like Trua and many others are explicitly going into Palestinian orchards to try to protect them from the settlers.
And Agent Orange isn't the only dioxin-based herbicide that we've been using. There's a whole whole cadre of different colors of dioxin-based herbicides that the military has used. And as a disabled veteran, I was never exposed to it, but I have worked with many veterans who were, and they are suffering horribly for it also. So nobody won with the use of those dioxin-based herbicides. Yeah. Yeah, I was just emailing Rabbis for Human Rights about this issue yesterday, in fact. Because I would love to know why the Rabbanut and the Memshalah are not in prison for this. You know, it's just offensive to me as a rabbi that they can violate halakha like this and get away with it. But does this justify Hamas and the Palestinian Authority attacking Israel? Does it justify the antipathy that the Palestinians feel towards Israel? You know, the way I look at it, here's what I see about this. You know, the same agency that created the state of Israel, which was, at the time was the League of Nations, which is now the United Nations, also created the state of Palestine. In a perfect world, Israel's borders would be the biblical borders, but it's not a perfect world. And the same agency that gave Israel statehood gave Palestine statehood. And so Israel should, you know, wake up and smell the coffee. And if they want to build settlements, build them in the Negev. I've been at a moshav in the Negev and seen how they can turn sand into Gan Eden. No other country in the Middle East can do that, but Israel can. So, you know, Israel should stop trying to, you know, monopolize the West Bank and just get over it and move into the Negev where they can turn sand into beauty. That's my feeling about it. And if they would do that, maybe there'd be some peace in Israel. But when you have hawks like Netanyahu as Rosh Memshalah, it's not going to happen. Myrtle, I see you shaking your head. Can you unmute, please?
Sorry, yes, I'm very glad to hear you say what you've just said. Yeah. I was in Israel in 73. I was lived there for several years, and it's been 50 years of just downward terrible, terrible for me. And I've always been disturbed by the olive tree issue.
You from ZA? South
Yes,
Africa?
yes.
Thought I could recognize that in your voice.
It's okay. Thank you for what you're saying.
You're quite welcome. Okay, next one, content warning, we're going to be talking about bodily functions. Okay, this is a commandment about setting up a sanitary area outside the camp. That when you remember, we didn't have plumbing and sewers and toilets and things back then, that you have a dirty area outside the camp and you should have a pike with you. And when you go outside, you dig a trench, you do your business and then bury your business afterwards, because God walks within the camp and God doesn't want to see the dirty stuff. Which is kind of funny because God created all of it, including the dirty stuff, but God doesn't want to see the dirty stuff. So this is about keeping the planet clean, not polluting our environment, basically. And, we can extract bigger meanings from this. This is a simple thing when you have a relatively small number of people, it's not difficult. But keep in mind that the Israelite camp was 2 million people already. And 2 million people's worth of excrement is a large amount of excrement. So it became quite a management problem to do this. And if they're setting up agricultural businesses, you have quite a lot of fertilizer there. Okay, the mother bird and the hen. If you chance upon a bird's nest on the road, in any tree, or on the ground with chicks or eggs, and the mother is roosting, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall surely send away the mother, and you may take the young, so it'll be well with you, and you have a long life. Okay, why do you send away the mother and just take the chicks?
Reproductive age.
Okay, can you say more, Fred?
As gruesome as this is to vegetarians and animal rights activists, the mother may still be capable of more young in the near future. It's sort of proven capability there.
Okay,
No.
in other words, propagation of the species.
Yes.
Yeah, the babies may not be a lot of meat, but if you take the mother, then you may not be propagating the species as well. Exactly. Rambam says that if you kill the mother and the chicks, you jeopardize the species, but if you allow the mother to live, she can have more chicks. Whereas if you kill the babies, they may not survive, because babies alone can't survive on their own, because the mother has to catch food for them. Okay, we've talked about this already. What kind of idolatry are we talking about in climate change? Okay, so I really searched as much as I could through Deuteronomy, and that was about it for environmental texts. So now I'm going to open it up for questions and comments generally. Fred?
Well, if there are questions and comments, please go first. I actually have 3 more from Deuteronomy that I think might be worth consideration. But
Okay, go for it.
okay, so very quickly, Deuteronomy 8 is this wonderful reminder that when you enter the land and you inherit houses you didn't build and fields that you didn't clear the stones, it's very easy with your material wealth to forget the source of your bounty. But if you forget the material wealth, then I mean, if you forget the source, then it becomes one of those warning texts, but it's very explicitly a kind of rooting the Jewish anti-materialist ethos, which is so important in this day. A second one would be right after the last one. Deuteronomy 22:8 says when you build a new house, you should put a parapet around the roof, which is the basis of the precautionary principle, which has direct application not only in medicine, but in to climate. And finally, the one that we all know about, choose life, that it's not just choose life for us, it's intergenerational. Lama'an tichya ata v'zarecha, in order that you and your descendants may live. And that introduces an extra oomph, hopefully, to our activism.
Okay, when I looked at the parapet, I didn't necessarily think of that in environmental considerations. That I saw that as an individual safety thing, like an OSHA kind of thing. But or a liability thing. But I personally didn't go environmental, so that's an interesting read. The houses that you didn't build, you're taking over other people's property. So that's an interesting thought. And then could you go over that last one again once more, please?
Yeah. So Deuteronomy 30:19, the famous call, Uvacharta b'chaim, choose life. Usually we only say that, but it's intergenerational, because the choices we make, like our footprint and how much we advocate for more sustainable systems, actually have life and death impacts for those who come after us.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We live longer and longer, and we consume more and more. And as we do that, we pollute more and more. Is that better? And in the process, we use more and more medical care, and, medical care creates so much plastic waste, it's appalling. And, the newest and greatest drugs have so many horrible side effects. And, you look at the amount of prescription drug and prescription drug byproducts found in our water systems. And all of that because we're choosing life. And we're forcing people to live artificially long lives. And we don't, like the Scandinavians, allow people, for instance, people with dementia, to choose a dignified end if they want to. And my wife is suffering with that. She really would love to go to Scandinavia and choose a dignified end to her life if she could, but she can't, because you have to be a resident. And so, Myrtle, please.
There we go. There we go. This is a whole new, different idea that you're talking about. This idea of what is a sustainable life, and what is our obligation in terms of living a good Jewish life, to know when we've had our time. And societally, how we deal with this. And of course, this is the huge big elephant in the room. It's the elephant of overpopulation. It's the elephant of this species that is the most invasive species on the planet.
Well, think about how long they kept Sharon in a vegetative state.
Yes.
In a facility when he was brain dead.
Right. And that's just one example. I mean, I think that sooner or later, all cultures are going to have to face this. And I don't hear it being faced or discussed in the Jewish world, but then I'm not listening to what the Jewish world is saying all the time. So I'm really sort of grateful that you've at least brought it up as something that, yes, we have to at least consider. I mean, we need a whole session on this at the next Limud thing. Thank you, Liberty.
There's so many different parts of this, and choose life. We're commanded to live, but is it really living? When you're an Ariel Sharon and you're a brain dead persistent vegetative state being kept alive by a machine, that's not life. If they had taken him off the machine and done an apnea test, he would not have passed the apnea test. He would have been declared dead, but halakha does not allow performing the apnea test. Once connected, you cannot disconnect. And that's the problem with the strict Orthodox interpretation of medical halakha. It doesn't, and it's very cruel to the families because they're kept in essentially a state of aginut for very long periods of time, aginut and aninut, for very long periods of time, and huge amounts of money are wasted, and huge amounts of resources that could be better used caring for people who have a chance of living. I mean, think about the amount of healthcare resources that are expended on someone like that you could, expend saving somebody's life. It's just Kaval Islam in the bad way, not the good way. Absolutely, Fred. Yeah, we are totally the most invasive species. We may not be the most populous species on this planet, but we are the most destructive.
I was giving props to Myrtle for that frame and noting that in the next hour, the Eco Musar session is going to touch on exactly that theme around the attribute of humility, which could be understood collectively.
Okay. Other questions, comments? We have a couple others who haven't popped out with thoughts yet. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Rachel, what time is it for you in New Zealand? I'm really curious.
It's 8:15 a.m. on Monday.
Rachel, you're right. Some societies are far more conservative with resources than others, particularly indigenous societies. You're also talking about much lower population densities and much lower wealth and when you're talking about poor indigenous societies that have nothing, of course they don't consume and corrupt. It's the very rich, high density capitalist societies that consume and corrupt. And now I feel like we're getting into the Ashamnu or something. We should be doing this in October, not in April.
And the Ashamnus are also this tendency to force large populations into areas which are unsafe on multiple fronts, moving them into areas which are prone to earthquakes and famine and water insecurity and all these other things. We are pushing our own species in a way that is really just unsound Jewishly.
Well, as we saw last week, even areas that are not prone to earthquakes have them, and everybody in New York freaked out. An earthquake can happen anywhere, a fire can happen anywhere, a flood can happen anywhere. Natural disasters are not limited to the West Coast. Even though they have floodings, fires, and earthquakes on very large scales on the West Coast, all of those can happen in great scale on the East Coast and in the central US as well.
Well, there are huge areas in Turkey and that part of the world which are particularly vulnerable in this kind of way, and where destruction, when it happens, is absolutely terrible.
Absolutely. The Anatolia earthquake and things like that. Yeah.
So Rabbah, we have about 1 minute left. If there's a way that you want to wrap things up, that now would be the time.
Okay, well, so I appreciate everybody's contributions. As we can see, whether you read Deuteronomy as a prophetic or historical book in the context of biblical authorship, which is not something that I worry about in my scholarship, it is very prophetic for us in our modern times in terms of reading it as a cautionary tale on the environmental disasters that we're experiencing today. And that was the point of this workshop, to realize that, as Ben Bogbog says, turn it and turn it because everything's in it. Kol tuv, everybody. Thank you for being here.